less than what I have. Okay, I just put them on. So there were two separate. Sorry, two separate DWR coverings.
Hi, everyone who's joined a little early. Welcome. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our WRMP EcoAtlas Landscape Profile Tool webinar. Great to see you here. There are actively many people joining this meeting, so we'll give them just a few minutes to get in the room here before we get started. Okay, welcome everybody. This is our WRMP EcoAtlas Landscape Profile Tool webinar. Great to see you here. There are still more people joining, but we'll go ahead and get started so that we can have the full hour here to present this exciting tool to you all. My name is Sasha Harris-Levitt. I'm a program manager of the WRMP, a lead environmental scientist at the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. Welcome. Next slide, please. Here's some pictures of the beautiful wetlands in our region to entertain you as a few more people join. Okay, next slide, please. So today you'll be hearing from WRMP staff members and chair of our technical advisory committee to talk about the EcoAtlas Landscape Profile Tool. So they'll give an introduction to the San Francisco Estuary Wetlands Regional Monitoring Program. We call it the WRMP, in case you haven't heard our acronym. Then we'll talk about the EcoAtlas Landscape Profile tools in general, and we'll talk specifically about how these profile tools are useful for wetland decision makers. Then we'll dive into the WRMP landscape profile tool and teach you how to use it, teach you about all the different components and what it includes. We'll have a short poll at the end, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. So I will turn it over to Lisa Beers, one of the co-lead scientists for the WRMP, to give the introduction to the program.
Good afternoon, everybody. Like Sasha said, I'm Lisa Beers. I'm a staff member at San Francisco Estuary Institute and one of the co-lead scientists for the WRMP, along with Dr. Viva Rossi. So for those who don't know about the WRMP, I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the program. So our mission is to deliver a coordinated regional monitoring of the San Francisco Estuary's wetlands to first inform science-based decision-making for wetland restoration and adaptive management, and second, to increase the cost-effectiveness and permit-driven monitoring associated with wetland restoration projects. And the WRMP is co-implemented by the San Francisco Estuary Partnership and San Francisco Estuary Institute. And the WRMP is a long time in the making. Over the past 25 years, with the visioning and strategy in 2016 through 2022 is when the program development really started getting going. We had funding through the EPA to start this. And then starting in 2022, and now we're doing program implementation. And in 2024, we actually started to collect data across the estuary. So very excited to be a part of this program when we are actually in the implementation phase. So the WRMP is focusing on 6 main priority site networks that are shown in the light yellow in the map. And the goal is to have broad geographic coverage across the estuary. And we are addressing our guiding questions and near-term science priorities within these areas. We also have secondary networks across the estuary, including in Montezuma, or in the Sassoon, so that we can better collaborate with the research that's going on within the Delta. Within the WRMP, we are building upon historical and existing wetland monitoring projects so that we are building upon what's already been done within the estuary and not reinventing the wheel. Goal is to inform existing and planned tidal restoration projects and also contribute to climate change planning for underserved communities. And our funding is currently through the EPA and the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. So within each of our priority networks, we have a series of tidal wetland sites based on the age and status of these wetlands. So we have benchmark sites, which represent a long-term outcomes of restoration projects. We have reference sites, and these represent midterm restoration projects. So these are our older restoration sites. And then we have project sites, which are newly restored tidal wetlands within the estuary. And like I said, these are nested within all of our priority networks. And this map is an example of one of our priority networks, the Alameda Creek Network. So we follow the EPA's 3-tiered approach. The level 1 is a landscape assessment, and this is largely what the profile tool is representing today. We have a level 2, which is rapid assessment. And for the WRMP, we're implementing the California Rapid Assessment Method. And we have a level 3, which is the more intensive on-the-ground monitoring. And just to go a little bit into our current field work, so we are collecting data, elevation data, to inform our habitat mapping, looking at sediment dynamics with surface elevation tables through the USGS, looking at a variety of water quality measurements through the San Francisco Bay NER, and also for Oregon State University. We're doing vegetation monitoring across 18 sites, and our colleagues at UC Davis are doing a massive fish survey all across the estuary with over 100 points sampled twice per season. So we have a very broad assortment of data that we're currently collecting, and in the future, we will be collecting information on mammals and birds across the estuary. And with that, I will hand it off to Christina to talk about the profile tools.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So I'm going to provide a brief introduction to the EcoAtlas tools before Christina Toms then provides a case study on how they can be used. So the next slide, please. Just as a reminder, EcoAtlas is a scientifically produced tool set to visualize and track the abundance, diversity, and condition of aquatic resources and the projects that are enhancing and restoring those habitats within a watershed or a landscape context. So in addition to viewing data on an interactive map, the landscape profile tools allow users to quickly summarize information for an area of interest. So there are 3 profiles that summarize information with a watershed, within a watershed or landscape context. And the first one's the landscape profile. So once you select the profile, and if you can go to the next slide, a user will then be able to select an area of interest for generating a profile by either drawing a polygon on the map, selecting a predefined area from a list, or uploading a shapefile. And in this example, let's select the Petaluma operational landscape unit. So on the next slide, the landscape profile will then summarize information on the abundance, diversity, and aquatic resources within that particular OLU based on the California Aquatic Resource Inventory. And then also, if we go to the next slide, there are other kind of landscape scale summaries, such as historical aquatic resources, if they're available. And also, it summarizes the net change in wetland quantity based on projects that are in Project Tracker. And those are shown here on the map in different colors based on the status of the project. And this type of visualization can help with tracking no net loss. On the next slide, there is also a condition profile that summarizes ecological condition based on the California Rapid Assessment Method. And these different assessments are shown on the map in red. So this was that level 2 that Lisa spoke about earlier. And on the next slide, the CRAM assessments then are plotted on a cumulative distribution function plot to really get this overall assessment of the ambient condition for a selected area, and then also to be able to view condition of an individual project assessment, which are shown in the gray diamonds on this plot. And then the third profile is the connectivity profile, and this summarizes patch size distribution for different wetland types based on the California Aquatic Resource Inventory. And on the next slide, the profile will summarize these different patch sizes and are binned by a habitat. So this chart shows the historical tidal marsh patch sizes on the left in that tan color, and then on the right, it has the current patch sizes shown in gray on the right-hand side. And so regulators and funders or restoration managers can use these 3 different landscape profile summaries to help determine how to improve connectivity and fund projects that increase patch sizes, and then also to track regional progress towards meeting restoration goals. In addition, on the next slide, there are customized profiles that are tailored to programmatic reporting needs. And the WRMP profile is an example of a customized summary that shares monitoring results and analyses for the WRMP. And before we go into details on the profile, Christina Toms is going to share a case study on using some of these profiles, and then Lisa Beers will provide that scientific framework behind the visualizations.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Christina Toms. I'm an engineer in the planning division of the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board, and I also chair the technical advisory committee of the Wetlands Regional Monitoring Program. So thank you, all of you, for being here today and learning more about the WRMP. I only have 10 minutes, so I'm not going to get into a lot of fine-scale details about permitting, but I think folks here, hopefully many of you broadly understand that there's a sequence in which we avoid and minimize impacts to wetlands and waters of the state. And the priority first is always avoiding impacts. If you can't avoid impacts, then you minimize your impacts. And if you still have impacts, then you try to provide compensatory mitigation. And that compensatory mitigation for impacts to wetlands and waters, you usually provide compensatory mitigation of a similar type, often in the same general location or watershed. Again, I'm speaking in broad generalities, so every single project is different, and there's a lot of nuance in how we apply these regulatory frameworks. Also in the permitting world, you hear a lot about no net loss. And that's the California Wetlands Conservation Policy. That's an executive order that was issued in 1994. And one of the objectives of that policy is to ensure no overall net loss and a long-term net gain in the quantity, quality, and permanence of wetlands acreages and values in California. And that policy goes on to say that its goal is to achieve a long-term increase in wetlands acreage, functions, and values. Acreage can be often, hopefully, a relatively straightforward assessment, right? But how do you begin to assess the functions and values of a wetland? Next slide, please. And so this is where all of these site scale and landscape scale factors come into play. So at a site scale, to consider functions and values, we often want to think about the hydrology of a site. How frequently is it inundated? What is the duration of that inundation? The depth of inundation. Is inundation from the tides? Is it from watershed flooding? Is it the interaction of the two? What does site hydrology look like? Morphology, what are site elevations? Particularly in tidal wetlands, elevations are really critical. These are tidal marshes, right? They're inundated by the tides very frequently, and very small differences in elevation can result in really big changes in ecosystem function and values, changes in vegetation communities, changes in accessibility of the habitat for fish and wildlife. So morphology and elevation matters a lot. So we want to think about elevations relative to the tides. We want to think about channels, right? A lot of our tidal wetland species rely on channels to move in and out of tidal marshes. Patch size, what is the size of these wetlands and how are they connected to other wetland patches? We want to think about ecology, right? What is the diversity within these wetlands? Do we have diverse plant communities, diverse fish and wildlife communities? Are communities dominated by native versus invasive species? What about rare versus common species? What kind of biodiversity is represented here? These are all things these are all factors that contribute to an understanding of site, scale, conditions, and context. At the landscape scale, we think about the abundance and distribution of habitat types. We think about the physical and ecological connections between different habitats and between different types of habitats. And we want to think about how has the landscape shifted from historic conditions? Has there been large-scale wetland reclamation? Has there been damming of upstream watersheds? And what kinds of restorations are planned? So all of these site scale and landscape scale features really govern that assessment of the functions and values of wetlands that are being impacted, and also wetlands that you might want to consider for compensatory mitigation. And these are all conditions and contexts, or not perhaps not all of them, but many of them are addressed in these landscape profile tools that we're discussing today. Next slide, please. I also want to highlight the Wetland Type Conversion Framework. This was a report that was developed by SQUIRP and US EPA back in March 22 that provides a framework for how to think about wetland type conversion. And this is a big deal when we think about tidal wetland restoration, because, for example, a lot of wetland restoration sites, they're diked baylands, maybe they're managed marshes, or they're agricultural baylands that support seasonal wetlands. And when they're restored to tidal action, that's a shift, right? That's a type conversion going from one type of wetland to another. So how do we think about these type conversions when it comes to habitat restoration planning, determination of compensatory mitigation? You know, how do we balance, how do we think about those functions and values? So this was a document that was developed in consultation with the BRIT to provide a framework. It's a non-regulatory document. It's just a helpful guidance document to think about functions and values of different types of wetlands. Next slide, please. And here's essentially the conceptual approach that's discussed in that wetland type conversion framework. And I won't go through all of this with a fine-tooth comb, but I think you'll notice that a lot of these considerations here in this conceptual approach are elements that are addressed in our landscape profile tools. So the regional context, replacement of rare or historically impacted resource types, for example. We can go into our landscape profile tools and understand what were the historic distributions of habitats versus the existing distribution of habitats. We can do that at a site scale. We can do that at a wetland management unit scale. We can do that at the scale of an entire operational landscape unit. And Lisa Beers is going to talk a little bit more about that coming up. Landscape setting under feasibility and suitability. Again, this is something that all of these landscape profile tools get at. Next slide, please. So a case study of how these tools have been used in regulatory decision-making is the Pine Gulch Creek In-Stream Enhancement Project. And for folks who aren't familiar with this project, this was a long-term effort and a really, really neat collaborative effort between the Marin RCD, the National Park Service, and a lot of resource and regulatory agencies to try to help recover habitat for rearing coho salmon in Pine Gulch Creek, which is a tributary of Bolinas Lagoon along the outer Marin coast. And essentially what was happening was that there are a number of small farms along Pine Gulch Creek that had riparian rights, and they were diverting water from the streams in summer to irrigate their crops. But that was when the coho really needed those in-stream flows in order for them to rear and get big enough so that they could return to the ocean. So the RCD and the local farmers and the water board and a number of regular CDFW, a number of partners worked to develop a strategy to develop off-channel storage ponds for these farmers so that they could divert water from Pine Gulch Creek during the winter high flow season, fill their ponds, and then use the water from those ponds to irrigate their farm fields during the summer. And then they gave up their riparian rights. They gave up their diversions, their summer diversions from Pine Gulch Creek. This has been terrifically successful, and we've actually seen some recovery of coho in Pine Gulch Creek. And one of the tools that the Water Board used to support the permitting of this project was the Watershed Landscape Profile tool. In a lot of locations, these irrigation ponds were located in areas that already supported some floodplain seasonal wetlands or some seep wetlands, some kind of, wetland type. And we had to think about, okay, what are the trade-offs between these wetland types and this irrigation pond, this proposed irrigation pond. And so we use the Watershed Landscape Profile tool to assess how the functions and values of those proposed irrigation ponds would compare to other coastal and pond seep wetlands in coastal Marin and San Mateo counties. And so that was really helpful for us to understand the landscape context of these different wetlands, the functions and values that they provide within the landscape, and how to think about impacts and compensatory mitigation. Next slide, please. So some potential uses for these landscape profile tools for Bayland regulators. You can use a lot of these tools in combination with each other. The WRMP and Watershed Landscape Profile tools, you could use them together to understand site and landscape scale conditions and really provide that context for decision making. They can provide information about site conditions, like elevation capital, the ratio of vegetated to unvegetated marsh. And this information can help determine mitigation ratios. It can help decision makers anticipate the likelihood of compensatory mitigation succeeding and achieving its target functions and values, and allow for comparison between the functions and values of impacted landscapes versus the mitigation wetlands. And again, it can inform this analysis of wetland type change as articulated in that wetland type change framework that I just showed you earlier. So thanks a lot for letting me present this case study. And if folks have any questions, happy to get them later on.
Great, thank you, Christina. So I'm going to dive into the key components of the WRMP landscape profile tool, talking about the spatial extent that the tool covers and also the current metrics that we have. And then after this, Christina Grosso will dive into doing a demonstration of the profile tool itself. So first I'll start with the scales of analyses. So we know that the San Francisco Bay is quite a large estuary, that is comprised of very unique aspects within the estuary. So we have subembayments, we have operational landscape units, like different scales that we can investigate at, starting at the large and then getting smaller. Operational landscape unit, if you haven't heard this term before, it's an area that is expected to support a coherent suite of ecosystem functions along with their physical processes. So they're grouped together based on similarities, and nested within that are wetland management units, which are at a smaller scale that are relevant to managers. And then within that are analysis units, which are at the wetland scale or even smaller. And so this profile tool that we've developed is designed to be relevant at multiple levels and scales of management. So for example, at the sub-embayment level, a regional funding program may need to understand how baylands are faring across the estuary writ large. So looking at the North Bay versus the South Bay. At the wetland management unit level, a project manager of a restoration site will need to consistently assess how the project is changing over time. And there will be a time component incorporated into this profile tool in later updates. So our overall goal is to be able to address the needs of management at different scales. And just to give you an example of how fine scale it can get, so at the sub-embayment, it's divided into 5 different levels within the estuary. Once you get to the OLU level, there are about 30 different OLUs within the estuary. Going further down to the wetland management unit, there are several hundred of these that were identified by many of you participating in this webinar, managers. So we're designed to be relevant at the scale of managers' needs. And then also at the analysis unit level, drilling down to, there's over 1,000 of these analysis units. And so you can see how the scale of summarization can vary widely using this tool, depending on your needs. Diving into what we're actually including at the moment within our metrics. So all of these metrics are based at an estuary-wide, based on estuary-wide geospatial data that can be summarized across all of the different scales that I just presented. They are derived from a variety of products that have been developed through the WRMP, including the Baylands Habitat Map 2020, the Project Tracker Tidal Wetland Restoration Map 2020, which we refer to as the restoration map, and also elevation data. And the initial metrics that we have included are tidal wetland extent, restoration status, unvegetated to vegetated ratio, or UVVR, and elevation capital. And I will go into each of these data layers and metrics now. So the Baylands Habitat Map 2020 was developed in 2024, but it reflects the habitats as of 2020. And it is the first high-resolution habitat map since BARI, which was developed in, or represents conditions in 2009. It was created by the WRMP using automated, consistent, and repeatable methods, and includes standardized habitat classifications so that when we do future updates, like we are about to do this year for conditions in 2025, that we know that we're comparing apples to apples when we are looking at our habitat map. So in the development of this, we used object-based image analysis, high-resolution aerial imagery, or NAIP. We used elevation data created through acquisition of LiDAR data and other metrics to classify our habitats. And so our goal is to update this every 4 to 5 years, and we are currently about to start working on the BHM 2025, so stay tuned for more information on that. And we also have another WRMP webinar about the Baylands Habitat Map that is available on our website. So last year, we also rolled out the restoration map, and is particularly for the profile tool, we're using the map that represents conditions in 2020. So this map is derived from user-generated inputs to the EcoAtlas Project Tracker web tool. And it's providing not only the locations and names of these restoration sites, tidal wetland restoration sites in particular, but then also the age that they were, or the date that they were breached, the tidal regime, and all of these were step-by-step reviewed by WRMP staff to ensure consistency and accuracy. We've developed 2 maps so far, one representing conditions in 2020, another in 2024. And both of these are available both at the WRMP website and the SFEI website. And we are soon to release the restoration map for 2025. And that'll be available in just a couple of months. So please stay tuned for that as well. So in the process of developing both the BHM and the Restoration Map 2020, we wanted to find a way of consistently describing typologies for our tidal wetland sites in the estuary. And so we developed a process, which we called the protocol, which includes the Baylands Habitat Map, where you have the locations in your habitat classes. It combines this with our restoration sites. And between the two of them, not only are we talking about or get to understand our tidal wetland extent, but also how restoration sites are progressing over time. And within this, we developed 3 tidal wetland habitat classifications to help us see how our wetlands are faring over time and across the estuary. So we have our existing tidal wetlands, and so these are ancient or centennial tidal wetlands occurring outside of restoration projects. Our restored tidal wetlands basically have the same functions, ecosystem functions as existing tidal wetlands, but they were restored to tidal flow either through intentional or unintentional means. So they are supporting, they have well-defined channels and vegetations, and there still may be some areas that are accreting in elevation or accreting sediment to eventually be vegetated. And then we have a third class called evolving tidal wetlands. So these are our restored sites that are newly restored, or those that are older but are lower in elevation, and they've not quite reached tidal elevations where vegetation can occur. So we found it important to differentiate between the two different types of restored wetlands so that we can track not only how restored sites are faring, but also if there's any sites that may be stalled in their restoration or experiencing impacts of sea level rise and reverting back to mudflats. So I just wanted to provide this context to explain what our metrics are showing. And then our last information that we include within the profile tool, it's based on digital elevation model that was compiled through a variety of LiDAR data sets that were recently collected. This was a key layer for the Baylands Habitat Map, and all elevations were made relative to modeled tidal data so that we could consistently compare elevations across the entire estuary that take into consideration differences in tidal regime. This is very critical to understanding our tidal wetland restoration trajectories and vegetation colonization. And just wanted to highlight that in the fall of last year, we collected LiDAR data for the entire estuary, including the delta, at low tide. And this will be used to create DHM 2025, and it will also be freely available this spring once we've had a chance to do QA/QC of the data. And there will also be a corresponding webinar. So please sign up to the WRMP newsletter so that you can receive more information when we're having this webinar. All right, so now to get into our to our metrics. So the first one is pretty straightforward. It's tidal wetland extent. So this metric provides a summary of Bayland habitat types, an area of each at the scale that you choose. And so this is including habitats represented that they match the BHM classification regime. So we're highlighting 8 different habitat types within this metric. And if you want more information on this, there's a webinar that we did regarding this, and also a corresponding document that you can find on the website. So draw your attention to the graph and summary or the map and summary on the right-hand side of the screen. So I'm going to start at the site scale and then go up so that represent, or you can see how this the profile tool can summarize data. So I'm narrowing in here at the Sonoma Baylands pilot project. So this is a restoration site. And looking at the tidal wetland extent, you could see it's about 50-50 of high marsh or just vegetated marsh, and also tidal flats. Scaling up to the OLU level, you could see that the majority of the tidal habitat within this within this OLU is a vegetated marsh, but you also have your tide flats and channels. And then scaling up to the subembayment, you get a summary of all of the different habitat or tidal habitat types within here. So just to scroll back down, just to see the changes of that are represented in habitat types. And you also have the area for each wetland type included. Our next metric is restoration status. So this is bringing in the 3 different typologies that I just discussed of existing, restored, and evolving tidal marshes. And so this metric provides area estimates on these typologies, and also you get a sense for how it changes at the different scale that you're interested in. So this is important for tracking tidal wetland change over time, your increases in restoration site acreage at larger scales, and also to be able to look at differences across the bay. So following the same site and also the different scales of analysis as in the last metric, focusing in on the Sonoma Baylands project, so you can see since this is a restoration site, it's almost 50-50 divided between restored and evolving tidal wetland. As you scale up to the OLU, see the majority of this OLU is existing tidal wetlands, but there's also about a quarter of them that have been restored. And then looking at the subembayment level, about 50% of this huge embayment is comprised of existing marshes, but then you can also see that there's another approximately 50% that have been restored. And again, there's the acreages associated with each. Going to the next metric, this is unvegetated and vegetated ratio. So UVVR is a remote sensing based index that relates the amount of unvegetated areas to those that are vegetated. So larger values for UVVR mean that there are more unvegetated areas compared to vegetated. It can be recalculated over time to document how a site is maturing. And this is particularly important for restoration sites. But it can also be used to highlight where sites are stressed and losing vegetation. So where there's impacts of sea level rise or other changes in hydrology or lack of sediment. And so this is a key metric in restoration site development and project permit compliance. So if we're looking at the site level of Sonoma Baylands, the UVVR value is 1.2. And so it's meaning that there are slightly more unvegetated areas than vegetated within the site. Scaling up to the OLU level, the majority of the wetlands are vegetated within this OLU, so the UVVR value has dropped down to 0.2. But then as you scale up to the subembayment level, this goes up a bit more because there are more sites that are developing, they're more recently restored. So depending on the scale that you're looking at, you could see changes in what this ratio is. And then finally, the last metric that we have within our profile tool is elevation capital. And so this allows for standardized comparison of ground elevations relative to the tides. And compared to other parts of the country or the world, since we have semi-diurnal tides, it's really important to not only look at elevation capital in terms of mean high water, but also mean higher high water. And there have been many studies that have shown that there's the most plant diversity at mean higher high water or above. And it's also where there's refuges for extreme high tides for our endangered species and other animals that use our wetlands. So within this metric, there are three key things that are highlighted. So the percentage of area that's below mean high water, the percentage of area that's between mean high water and mean higher high water, and that which is above mean higher high water. So it can assist in prioritizing restoration site locations and candidates for sediment placement. And wetlands that have high elevation capital are more likely to persist with sea level rise. So going back to our case study of the Sonoma Baylands project, we see that the majority of the site is below mean higher high water, and that's to be expected because this is a restoration site that was initially lower in elevation. As we scale up to the OLU level, you see the majority of the wetlands, and this is largely driven by the ancient Petaluma Marsh, that these elevations are at or above mean or higher high water. So this is promising for these sites in light of sea level rise. And then going at the subembayment level, it's approximately it's between mean higher high water and mean higher high water and above for the entire subembayment. And with that, I'm going to hand this off to Christina Grosso so she can highlight how to use this tool.
Thank you so much. That was a really great background. And there are a couple of questions in the chat that I think it would be helpful if you maybe address before we move on to the demo. So one of them is from Emma asking, regarding the evolving marsh definition, what does undifferentiated mean in this context?
So this is one of the classes that's within the Baylands Habitat Map. And so it's could include areas that are lower in elevation. So it could be like more subtidal data, but it's just another type of wetland class.
Okay. And then there's also a question about, does the DEM account for vegetation height?
For this particular one that was developed, it does not, because it was a compilation of a whole bunch of LiDAR acquisitions across the estuary. But the one that we will be releasing shortly, representing 2025 conditions, will be vegetation corrected.
I have a follow-up question on that. Is it going to be vegetation corrected across the entire bay or just for Sassoon? It looks like you guys used the lean corrected DEM for Sassoon. I believe there is a lean corrected version for the entire San Francisco Bay.
So we will be, this will be for the entire bay, and we currently have field crews in the marshes now collecting elevation data in areas that can be easily confounded by thick thatch. So in our bulrush sites, so we do have an active team out right now, ensuring that we are doing the best that we can to correct for the vegetation heights.
Awesome, thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Lisa. That was a great background. And so now I'm going to show you how to actually generate those charts that Lisa was showing you. So this is the EcoAtlas toolset. So once you click in from the map, you can click on a particular region. So let's just zoom into the Bay Area. And as a default, the California Aquatic Resource Inventory map is displayed. And the Baylands Habitat Map, I'm just going into the legend, into the toggle. You can toggle to just see the Baylands Habitat Map. So to generate the WRMP profile, this is within the toolbox. So let me just make this a little larger. And over here on the upper right-hand corner, you select Show Tools. And under Generate Summary Reports, you click on Landscape Profiles. And so the WRMP profile is listed here under the Customized Profiles, and then you go to select a defined area. And so I'm just going to follow the same order that Lisa did in her presentation. And I'm also going to put a link to the profile tool within the chat in case people wanted to follow along. So let's start at the Wetland Management Unit. So Lisa showed you the Sonoma Baylands pilot project. So you would select that from the drop-down list, and then the report would be generated based on those different metrics that Lisa showed you. So the tidal wetland extent, the restoration status, the unvegetated to vegetated ratio, and then the elevation capital. And then in addition to be able to view the report dynamically on the online report, you can also select print report. And what this will do is generate a PDF report of all of the information. And this is really great for doing outreach, or if you want to include it in a grant application. And so it basically has all of the information that is on the online tool, but just in a different format and with just a little bit more information in the intro. So it has all 4 of those metrics also summarized. And then the great thing about this is it's also time stamped. So let's go back to the profile tool. So now let's go up a level. So this is the wetland management unit. And so then let's just zoom out a little bit and select the next level. Under predefined areas, you would then select the operational landscape units. So Lisa was looking at the Petaluma operational landscape unit. So by clicking on the map, it will then regenerate those pie charts based on this new geography. So as Lisa was mentioning, you can see the changes in the habitat types, the changes in the restoration and in the different metrics as you change that scale. And then if we zoom up one more level, so let's go back out and we'll select a new region. And this time we will select WRMP sub-embayments. So at this level, let me also just turn off the operational landscape units so that we can really see those larger sub-embayment boundaries. So if we select sub-embayments, you can see here is the San Pablo sub-embayment. We will click on that area, and then it will also regenerate those charts based on this new geography. And as you can see, there's definitely room to add additional metrics or different analyses as the WRMP continues to grow. One other item I did want to show you, because sometimes it's overlooked in EcoAtlas, is if you go to the left-hand side on some of these map tools, you can zoom to a location. So I know sometimes it's hard to kind of orientate yourself. So we could type in, say, let me just type in this, Pine Gulch Creek. So the example that Christina was showing us. And then it will take you to that location, and we can even go ahead and maybe turn on the CARI data layer just so that we can get some background of the inventory. So this is very similar to what Christina showed in her example, but this is just a great way to be able to quickly find your location, and you're able to type in a street address, a city, a place name like I did, or even a lat long, and it will zoom the map to that location. Now I'd like us to switch over to some updates. So this was phase 1 of the WRMP profile. It was released a few months ago, and we're already working on a phase 2. So one of the main improvements was that, as Lisa mentioned, the analysis units are not being captured right now in that first phase. So right now, we are currently working on adding this in as an additional geography within the tool. So I'm going to show you some screenshots from Lindsay Sims' development site. Lindsay is part of SFEI's software engineering team and is the lead EcoAtlas web developer. And both Lindsay and Gemma Schusterman from the software engineering team are on this call. So if there's any technical questions, they are also here. So one bit of information we heard from the release of the first WRMP profile tool was that it would be great, in addition to having a drop-down list, just to be able to click on a map and select your wetland management unit. That not everyone knows where all of those different management units are located. So if you were to click on the map, then the outlines of the wetland management units come up, and right here is a Sonoma Baylands pilot project. So if we were to click on that particular polygon within the map, then you would also have this generated for you. It's the same 4 metrics, but in addition, for each of them, you do have the analysis units that are broken down according to that metric. So they're also labeled on the map, and then they're also displayed here as a bar underneath the overall pie chart. And this is also true for the restoration status and the other metrics. This is still being worked on and being reviewed with the TAC, because while this may work okay with this particular wetland management unit that only has 2 analysis units, some of them have quite a few, and the display of that information gets a little bit tricky. So this is still being reviewed, gathering feedback, but this is definitely screenshots from what is in progress right now. And then also just wanted to highlight that in addition to adding the analysis unit, to the ability to click on a map to be able to identify your area of interest, there are other metrics that could be added to the profile tool. So for example, marsh patch size and connectivity. As Lisa mentioned, soon we will have a Baylands Habitat Map 2025, and we could begin to add change over time visualizations between the 2020 and the 2025 maps, as well as also in that extent of restoration. And really adding in these more trends and change over time will just make the profile a more useful and valuable tool. So to help us also, to help the WRMP guide the priorities for data visualizations, we would also like us to issue a poll to get some of your feedback on some of the other metrics that you would like to see displayed in the WRMP landscape profile tool. So I'm going to launch the poll, and then we will also have time for questions. So let me go ahead and launch the poll. And hopefully everyone can see that. And I will also begin to share the results. Is everyone able to see the poll okay? Great, thank you. So in addition to having some of these data metrics that would be useful, just to keep in mind that some of these are not in EcoAtlas yet. Most of them are not, except for the wetland condition and CRAM data. And then we are also just asking a few questions on the sector of work you work in professionally, as well as your role.
Christina, I don't think we can respond to the poll. It's a results
Huh. Thank you,
version of it.
Erica.
We might have to reissue the poll because we looked at it at the beginning.
Okay. So let me try this again. Thank you so much for saying that. Okay. How about that, Erica?
This one works. I can
Thank
respond to
you.
it.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks for getting in your responses. Looks like vegetation is top of the list for people. Right up there with sediment, wetland visitation, and bird data. And CRAM is also a kind of a high one also. All right, well, we can leave the poll going on, but this is really helpful, and we really appreciate you answering some of these questions. This will really help the WRMP kind of guide their priorities towards next metrics to include in the profile tool. So I think now we could just take some questions. If anyone has a question they'd like to put in the chat or to raise their hand, or we'd love to hear any comments or feedback. And Kelly, you had quite a long comment. Maybe you want to just come off mute and ask your question.
Yeah, sorry for the length. I was just
No,
trying.
no, that's perfect, but just
Okay.
maybe you could describe it.
Just like more context setting, like how do we look at profile results for these metrics and understand what they mean in terms of progress towards like a regional target? Are those set for functional goals at like the sub-embayment level?
Kelly, I'm
Someone
trying to
want to take that?
Hi, Kelly, I'm trying to understand your question. Are you saying are there regional goals for UVVR or for elevation capital or things of that nature?
Yeah, like because I can look at a percentage of like
Yeah.
vegetated to unvegetated. I'm like, great, like that's a percentage. I don't know what that means for that sub-embayments progress towards what is the ideal percentage of that ratio for different sub-embayments?
So this is probably a better discussion for a WRMP Technical Advisory Committee meeting, but there's a lot of science about what different UVVR ratios, what different elevation capitals mean in terms of functions and values of tidal marshes. So for example, mature tidal wetlands with higher elevation capital are more likely to support a lot of for example, threatened and endangered species like salt marsh harvest mouse, ridgeways rail. We need mature kind of salt marsh for those species, not mud flats, right? Um, Similarly, the trends in some of these metrics over time can tell us how those wetlands are doing, how they're responding to climate change, how they're responding to restoration and adaptive management actions. So, for example, if we see UVVR ratios gradually moving over time towards more unvegetated versus vegetated, that tells us that our marshes are drowning. They're converting to mudflat. Their channel densities are increasing such that they're losing elevation capital. They're losing vegetation, and so it's not necessarily that there's numeric targets for any of these things, but it's what they tell us cumulatively about the health and condition and diversity and resilience of our tidal marshes.
Super helpful. Yeah, I think at a general level of just trying to help like I'm not a lay person, but like I'm one click up from any of these individual metrics and just to communicate like what does this metric give us a sense of how we're doing in terms of towards where we'd like to be. I think that's kind of one click up of what would be helpful.
Yeah, I think if you were to look at, for example, the Wetlands Regional Monitoring Program, our monitoring plan from 2023, that really dives into the science of a lot of these different metrics. Um, our monitoring plan, our implementation plan, even going back to the 2020 program plan. In fact, you might find an appendix to the 2020 program plan particularly helpful. That's a suite of conceptual models that really kind of distills the science of why are we measuring these things? Why do they matter? What do they mean? And so that might be a great one for you to check out.
And
I'll just,
also there was, oh, go ahead, Sasha.
I was just going to add that our estuary website that was recently released has really good roll-ups of regional indicators. I think this landscape profile tool, a lot of these metrics are also really useful for looking at restoration projects in a slightly smaller than like the whole bay-wide context, looking at a restoration project within the context of the OLU, for example. So if you're looking for like whole bay-wide roll-ups of a lot of different regional indicators, I think that our estuary website is a really good place to find that.
Thank you.
And then Laura Feinstein also had a comment about just providing more context on how to interpret the metrics would be helpful. So maybe that's a takeaway on how we can better add that information into the online tool or some of these resources that people could access.
I will add briefly that we're in the process of developing 2-page fact sheets for each of these metrics, which will be highlighting the basic information of every one of them and the salient points and takeaways from them. So those will be available soon as well.
That's great, Lisa. And then Josh Collins had a comment about some additional tool developments. There was a lot of chatter in the chat about the Baylands Habitat Map and being able to visualize change over time, but just wanted to see if anyone had any comments, or Josh, you had anything else you wanted to say.
No, I'm fine. I'm just curious as to what you're dreaming about. You've got a lot on your plate already, and you're making so much progress, but I'm guessing every one of you is thinking past that to whatever's coming up in the next few years. So I was curious if you had any short list of the things you might want to do. integration, for example, between this tool and the adaptation atlas, for example, or some of the other things coming out of SFEI, if you intend to begin merging those together so that people don't have to go to different websites to get related information. I'm just curious as to what you're thinking about in the future.
Well, there's a lot that we can do now that we're going to have these two maps that we can be able to look at change over time. And as you said, to kind of bring in some of these other data sources. So I think the TAC has a lot to talk about at the upcoming meetings this year on what's next. This was kind of the first step just to get some of the results out there for the WRMP, but it's really just like a basic start that really we can improve upon.
Yeah, I'm like everybody else. I mean, you see this great stuff and you go, let's do more, let's do more. I know that's
Well, we
hard
want to
to
hear
do.
the ideas.
Yeah, that's very good. About the fact sheets for the metrics, I'm hoping that you link the metrics back to the management questions, so users can say, oh, these are not answers looking for questions. There are actually questions out there that these data are going to be addressing. I think that would be helpful for people to see. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. Thanks for joining. And I think we're close to time, so let me just put up the last slide so Sasha can wrap up and talk about next steps.
Okay, thank you. And I see two great suggestions in the chat too, that expanding the geographic coverage would be useful. And another feature that would be useful is being able to draw a polygon within an OLU and having the tool run a report with the GIS data within that polygon. So thank you for both of those suggestions. We'll make note of them. And thank you everyone for joining this webinar today. It's great to have you. If you're interested in looking at some of our past webinars or signing up for our newsletter where you'll hear about future webinars, you can do that on our WRMP website on the Engage tab. And we'll be having a webinar coming up later this spring about the LiDAR data that we've collected. It will be freely available. So we will hope that you can join us for that too. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.